Hey everybody, welcome back. This is part 2 of Comparative Advantage. In this video, we're going to talk about terms of trade, okay, or possible terms of trade that is, and the range of mutually beneficial trade terms, okay? So let me catch you up where we're at. We've got Japan and South Korea, and what you're looking at are the opportunity costs, because Comparative Advantage is based on opportunity costs. What this is saying is if Japan made one computer, they would give up 3.3 lines of code. And if Japan made one line of code, they would give up 0.3 computers. South Korea, same thing. Make one computer, give up 5 lines of code. South Korea makes one line of code, 0.2 computers. We already determined who has the comparative advantage in each good. But let's just do it real fast, real quick. One computer, so we're comparing apples to apples, if you will, or computers to computers. Okay, Japan makes one computer, they give up 3.3 lines of code. South Korea makes one computer, they give up 5 lines of code. Who's the lowest cost? Who has the lowest opportunity cost? Who's the lowest cost producer? Well, Japan is 4 computers. So I'm just going to circle that and point right up there to Japan. Japan's got it for computers. South Korea, we're looking at both again, Japan and South Korea. Let's look at one line of code, okay? Japan makes one line of code, they give up 0.3 computers. South Korea makes one line of code, they give up 0.2 computers. Once again, if you want to know where these numbers come from, go look at the prior video. But this is what we already did. We already know this. Who is the lowest cost producer of lines of code? Who has the lowest opportunity cost? Well, that is South Korea. When they make one line of code, 0.2. That's better than 0.3. So I'm going to circle lines of code, point over there to South Korea. With that said, we're ready to move on. We're ready to find a possible terms of trade, okay, a possible terms of trade, and the range of mutually beneficial trade terms. So what I've done is just set up a little bit of a template here, okay? There was no brain work that went into this. This is just a template you can always use, okay? What I did is I basically just grabbed a good. I picked a good. In this situation, computer. I could have just as easily put lines of code. In fact, you'll see I'm going to do it for lines of code in a second. But here at the beginning, one computer. Then I always write seller and buyer, okay? Seller and buyer. Once again, this is just a template. No brain power yet. And then I set up a range, okay? This is my range of mutually beneficial trade terms and a possible terms of trade going in right there. So why do I have LFC? That's the lines of code. Okay, so I got one computer. We're going to sell computers for lines of codes. That's just lines of code all the way across. One last time. This is a template, no brain power. Now once the template's set up, it's really easy to use. Okay, so who is going to be the seller of computers? Well, the seller is going to be the producer of computers. And who's the producer of computers? Japan, right? We've already determined. They've got the comparative advantage for computer making. So the seller is going to be Japan. So I'm going to write that in right there, which of course makes the buyer South Korea. Okay? Now let's go ahead and fill this part in. Okay? Here's the important thing. Japan, okay, they are selling computers. Okay? They're making computers. And what we want to see is what is a price that would make it beneficial for them. To understand this logic, stay with me for a second. I'm going to do something kind of interesting. Okay, I'm going to say, hey, if Japan did not trade, what would they get by giving up a computer? Okay, well, if they diverted resources from making one computer and made lines of code instead, go back over here, one computer, 3.3 lines of code, they would get 3.3 lines of code without trade, okay? So if they did not trade, they could simply divert resources from making one computer and make lines of code instead, and they could get 3.3. So here's the question, or maybe the statement, if you will. Japan, okay, it would be beneficial for them to go ahead and make one computer and then sell that computer for some price that was greater than 3.3. So, once again, if Japan could go ahead and make one computer and get more than 3.3 lines of code, it would be beneficial for them. That's the thing we want to focus on. Okay, let's go talk about South Korea. They're the buyer of computers. So what South Korea is thinking about doing is making lines of code and then selling the lines of code to get computers. Once again, South Korea is buying computers. They're going to need lines of codes to do that. So once again, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, without trade, how much would one computer cost South Korea? And that's easy. Just go over here, South Korea, one computer, 5 lines of code. Put my 5 lines of code right there. So without trade, what South Korea could do is divert resources from making 5 lines of code, and with those resources, they could make one computer. But wouldn't it be advantageous if they could go ahead and make some amount of lines of code that was less than 5, and then sell these lines of code for one computer? That would be beneficial. It would be awesome if what South Korea could do is use their resources to make some amount of lines of code that was less than 5, and then that amount of lines of code sell for one computer. So there we go. We have now got a range of mutually beneficial trade terms. Anywhere between 3.3 lines of code and 5 lines of code would be mutually beneficial. Both countries would benefit from trade, so we can pick any number that we want. Just to make it nice and simple, I'm going to pick 4. Okay, 4 is our terms of trade. And once again, I want to be pretty precise with my language here. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm doing a possible terms of trade. 4 is just one possible terms of trade. And I'm doing the range of mutually beneficial trade terms. This is the range of mutually beneficial trade terms, and that is a possible terms of trade. Now I just want to run through it again, but do it from the other standpoint, from lines of code, okay? So selling 1 line of code for computers, just to let you see it one more time. And this time I'll go as fast as I can. So, 1 line of code, who is the seller? The seller, well there it is, South Korea, the one that had the lowest opportunity cost. So I'm going to put South Korea right there, okay? And then who is the buyer? Of course the other country, that's going to be Japan. And we've got South Korea, once again, going to sell lines of code for computers. So here's the question we ask ourselves, without trade. If they did not trade, South Korea, they could divert resources from making 1 line of code, and how many computers could they make? Once again, South Korea, 1 line of code, 0.2 computers. 0.2 computers. So wouldn't it be great if South Korea could go ahead and make 1 line of code and then sell that line of code for some terms of trade that was greater than 0.2. That would be awesome. That would be good for South Korea. Now we've got Japan, the buyer of lines of code. So what is Japan thinking about doing? Making computers and selling those computers for lines of code. Once again, they are the buyer of lines of code. So the first thing we ask ourselves, without trade, how could Japan get 1 line of code? Well, there's Japan, 1 line of code. They could forego making 0.3 computers. So they could just not make 0.3 computers and divert the resources needed to make 0.3 computers and make 1 line of code. But wouldn't it be great with trade, via trade, if Japan could go ahead and make some amount of computers that was less than 0.2? If they could make some amount of computers that were less than, not 0.2, sorry. I pointed at 0.3 and said 0.2. So let me say that again. It'd be great if Japan could make some amount of computers that was less than 0.3. If they could make some amount of computers that was less than 0.3, it would be beneficial for Japan. Trade would be beneficial. So they'd love to make some amount of computers less than 0.3 and sell that amount for 1 line of code. So once again, I've got my range of mutually beneficial trade terms. Anywhere between 0.2 and 0.3, that would be beneficial. However, I can't just stick a number in this time. Why? Because I've already stuck a number in here. Okay? I've already determined that 1 computer is going to sell for 4 lines of code. And since I've already determined the terms of trade for 1 computer, I've already determined the terms of trade for 1 line of code. In other words, let me do a quick proportion. I'm going to take 1. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both of these by 4. So I'm going to take 1, divide it by 4, and I get 0.25 computers. Take 4, divide it by 4, I get 1 line of code. So all I did was a proportion there. Notice the equal sign. Those are the same thing. So what I'm saying is, once I determined the terms of trade for 1 computer was 4 lines of code, right there, I have determined that 1 line of code is going to sell for 0.25 computers. So I got to put 0.25 there. So 0.25. Now, of course, if I wanted to erase that, then I could put anything I wanted between the 0.2 and the 0.3. But once I stick a terms of trade in there, I've already established the terms of trade. One last time, this number and this number is a possible terms of trade. This is my range of mutually beneficial trade terms for computers. This is my range of mutually beneficial trade terms for one line of code. Hope that made sense to you guys. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you in the next video.